I like the new Marshall Emberton, but personally I do feel the Emberton is a little pricey for a 20-watt speaker. But the Emberton does have some standout characteristics when compared to the super popular JBL Flip 5 or the Sony XB23. So if you're looking into getting a small portable Bluetooth speaker and if you're thinking about getting the Emberton, let's see how it stacks up to these. Now, price-wise, the Emberton has a retail price of $150, which I do feel is a little pricey for a 20-watt speaker. And for comparison's sake, for the same $150, you could get the Sony XB23, which sounds way better. But nonetheless, the JBL Flip 5 has a retail price of $120, but routinely likes to go on sale for $100 sometimes, and maybe even $90. And the Sony XB23 has a retail price of $100. So if you want to pick any of these speakers up, they'll be linked down below. Now, first off, let's talk about the designs of these speakers. Durability-wise, all of these speakers are very rugged and they can stand up to constant bumps and scrapes if you take them on the go with you. And they're all waterproof, so you don't have to worry about them if these speakers get wet. But from a design standpoint, the Emberton is very different from these other two speakers. Now, both the JBL and Sony have a mostly fabric-wrapped body with plastic end caps, and they're both rocking a cylindrical design. Whereas the Emberton has a wire grill on both the front and back, and it's wrapped in this super durable rubber that also has a very good soft touch feel to it. So the Emberton does feel way more premium in your hands when compared to these other two speakers. And materials aside, personally, I feel the Emberton looks way better than these other two speakers when it's sitting on your desk, thanks to its classic Marshall design. And it's also a little smaller than the Flip 5, and it's way smaller than the XB23. So personally for me, the Emberton is the clear winner here when it comes to build quality and design. Now, when it comes to tech specs, all of these speakers charge via a USB-C port. But it's very important to keep in mind that all of these USB-C ports are strictly used for charging. You can't use any of these USB-C ports as a wired connection, and you can't use any of these USB-C ports to charge your own devices. And unfortunately, none of these speakers have an audio jack. Now, personally, I don't mind not having an audio jack on a speaker of this size, but I do think it would have been nice to have, and it is something to keep in mind depending on your setup or needs. Now, when it comes to battery life, the XB23 has the worst performing real-world battery life here. Now, this speaker has an advertised battery life of 12 hours, but that's when this speaker is playing at 50% volume while in stamina mode. And unfortunately, stamina mode on this speaker severely reduces its bass, so it makes the speaker sound very flat. But this speaker also has an advertised battery life of 10 hours while in extra bass mode, which is how you should use it. Now, while this speaker is in extra bass mode and playing at max volume, the XB23 is good for around 2.5, maybe 3 hours of playback time, and at 80% volume, this speaker is only good for around 4.5, maybe 5 hours of playback time. So overall, battery life on the XB23 is very so-so, especially considering its size. Now, when it comes to the Flip 5, this speaker has an advertised battery life of 12 hours. Now, at max volume, this speaker is good for around 4 hours of playback time, and at 80% volume, the speaker is good for around 8 hours of playback time. So battery life on this speaker is much better. But then there's the Emberton, which has an advertised battery life of 20 hours, which is above average for a speaker of this size. And at max volume, this speaker is good for around 6 hours of playback time, and at 80% volume, this speaker is good for around 12 hours of playback time. So if battery life is a really big concern for you, then this is the one to get. Now, when it comes to Bluetooth connectivity, all of these speakers can be connected to 2 devices at the same time, so you and a friend can both be DJ. But when it comes to audio codecs, just keep in mind that both the Flip 5 and Emberton are strictly using SBC, whereas the Sony XB23 has support for higher quality audio codecs like AAC and Sony's own LDAC. But now let's talk about speaker setups, because all of these speakers are very different. Like I mentioned at the top of this video, all three of these speakers are 20-watt speakers. But the Flip 5 has a single frontward firing driver and dual passive radiators shooting out the sides. Whereas the XB23 also has dual passive radiators like the Flip 5, but it has dual frontward firing drivers. But then there's the Emberton, which also has dual drivers and dual passive radiators like the XB23. But one driver and one passive radiator shoots out the front, and the other driver and other passive radiator shoots out the back. Now, personally, I do like the Emberton speaker setup because, first off, this speaker does a really good job of evenly filling a room with music. And you are going to get a performance boost out of this speaker if you place it up against a wall, either if you're using it indoors or out, because the music that the speaker is shooting out the back is going to have something to bounce off of. But when it comes to actually listening to music, all three of these speakers really do sound very different from one another. But so that you can hear for yourself, we're going to jump into a sound test.
Oh no, that is what they all say when they see me pouring some wine. Oh, think it's empty again. Better fill it up before I go. Cause I'm loving it, feeling it, touch me and being it. See what I see, nothing typical. Messing around with it, mix it up, go with it, flow with it, let it all go. Oh Lord, think you know what I'm like, but you don't fall, you lose control. Bittersweet melody when I dance on your fly. Cause I know what you don't. It is me you adore. How does it feel to breathe when you're dead? They never seen you out of your head. Cut to the bone, it's broken up. How sad. Oh boy, got so hot I forgot what I should have thought of before. Sure ain't easy for you to let go off the rules, cause there's so much fun. Are you loving the feeling that touch me? Are you in that? Don't see what you're seeing, typical. Messing around with it, mix it up, go with it, flow with it, cause let it go. Don't think I did it again. I said a few things that I shouldn't have done. Well, bittersweet melody when I dance on your fly. Cause I know what you don't. It is me you adore. How does it feel to breathe when you're dead? They never seen you out of your head. Cut to the bone, it's broken up. How sad. How does it feel to breathe when you're dead? They never.
So, like you may have just heard, all three of these speakers sound very different from one another. Now, I feel the Flip 5 is the worst sounding speaker here specifically because of the very narrow soundstage. When compared to these other two speakers, the Flip 5 sounds very claustrophobic, whereas both the Emberton and XB23 sound much more open. Now, the Emberton does like to put an emphasis on the mids, so the vocals on the speaker are rather pronounced. And, this is very typical of Marshall. Whereas the XB23 sounds much warmer, which is also to be expected because this speaker was in extra bass mode. Now, if you're not a fan of the XB23's warmer sound signature, then you do have the option of customizing its EQ to your liking. And if you want, you can make the XB23 sound like the Emberton by raising the mids and highs on the speaker. Now, also keep in mind, the XB23 is the only speaker here that lets you directly mess around with its EQ, because you can't do this with these other two speakers. And finally, when it comes to max volume, although all of these speakers do get decently loud for their size, the XB23 does get a little louder than these other two speakers. The Emberton is close behind, and technically the Flip 5 gets the least loudest here, but it really isn't a huge difference. Nonetheless, if your main priority here is sound, then the XB23 is the best sounding speaker here, because of its wider soundstage than the Flip 5 and customizable EQ. But now let's talk about speaker pairing protocols. Unfortunately, the Marshall Emberton doesn't have one, so you can't pair the Emberton up to another Emberton, and you also can't pair it up to any of Marshall's other portable Bluetooth speakers, like either a Stockwell 2 or an Acton. And personally, I do think that is rather unfortunate. Whereas both JBL and Sony do have speaker pairing protocols for their speakers. So if you want, you can always pair multiple speakers together and have them cover a large area with music. Or if your buddy gets a speaker of the same brand as you, then you can always hook them up. However, just keep in mind that there is some fragmentation to keep in mind going on in both Sony's and JBL's speaker ecosystem. Now, with the Sony XB23, you can only pair it up to other Sony speakers using Sony's new Party Connect. So you can only pair the XB23 up to another XB23, or a Sony XB33, or a Sony XB43. And unfortunately, you can't pair the Sony XB23 up to any of Sony's older speakers using wireless party chain, like either a Sony XB40 or a Sony XB32 or an XB22 or XB31 or XB31, and the list just goes on. And with the JBL Flip 5, you can only pair it up to JBL's newer speakers using Party Boost. So you can only pair the Flip 5 up to another Flip 5 or to a JBL Boombox 2 or a JBL Pulse 4 or to the JBL Extreme 3. And unfortunately, you can't pair the Flip 5 to any of JBL's older speakers using JBL Connect Plus, like let's say a Flip 4 or an original boombox or an Extreme 2 or a Charge 4 or Charge 3 or even a Pulse 3. But ultimately, I do prefer JBL's Party Boost over Sony's Party Connect, specifically because JBL speakers manage to establish a connection with one another much faster than Sony speakers. But with all that being said, even though I do feel the Marshall Emberton is a little pricey, the Emberton does make a case for itself. Design-wise, I think the Emberton is going to look way better when it's sitting on your desk than these other two speakers. And if you want to take it on the go with you, this speaker can still hang because the Emberton is super durable as well. But the standout characteristic about this speaker is its battery life. The Emberton can easily outlast both the Flip 5 and Sony XB23. And when it comes to sound, the Emberton is a decent sounding speaker that does like to put an emphasis on the vocals. But the speaker should still be able to handle all genres of music without any problems. But more importantly, thanks to its speaker setup, the Emberton does a really good job of evenly blanketing a room with music, and you can always get a performance bump out of it if you place it up against the wall. But if sound is your main concern, then you are better off going with the Sony XB23 because of its wide soundstage and customizable EQ. However, the XB23 does have some drawbacks to it, like its lackluster battery life, and plainly said, this isn't the best looking speaker. But then there's the Flip 5, which is the vanilla option here. The Flip 5 sounds good, but its soundstage isn't as wide as these other two speakers. But the battery life on the Flip 5 is way better than the Sony XB23, and the Flip 5 is more affordable than the Emberton. And if you do plan on collecting multiple speakers, then JBL's Party Boost is better than Sony's Party Connect. If you made it this far, I guess you enjoyed the video, so hit that like button and get subscribed. It helps out more than you realize. If you want to pick any of the products up mentioned in this video, those will be linked in the description down below, and you can also support the channel by checking out the merch store. But other than that, I'll catch you next time.